about to start on. So we okay, the mic is on. So from just so you just go ahead because this is a screen, but our camera is there, so we will look at the
Okay.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and very good morning. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this RTD, what we call it, Roundtable discussion on Islam, radicalism and extremism in the age of pandemic. We are very, very delighted to have a very distinguished speakers from Malaysia as well as from Indonesia. From Malaysia, nevertheless, we have Professor Dato Dr. Muhammad Hashim Kamali, the founding CEO of IAIS Malaysia. We also have our respected Kiai Haji Yahya, Cholil Staquf, the Secretary General of Nahdlatul Ulama, or we call it NU in Indonesia. Also, we have Assistant Professor Dr. Ahmad Al-Muhammadi from ISTAC-IIUM. And last but not least, we also have SAC Azman Omar, Assistant Director, Bukit Aman Special Branch, Royal Malaysia Police. Okay, we have these 4 speakers which are very well established in the subject matter that we are going to discuss. Ladies and gentlemen, as major crisis brought by the COVID-19 pandemic preoccupy the attention of global communities, the threat of violence and terrorism fueled by radical or extreme interpretation of religion remains a palpable concern. In March 2020, at the outset of the pandemic, the Islamic State or IS launched critical attacks in 7 countries, namely Egypt, Nigeria, the Philippines, Somalia, and Yemen. In the following month of April, ISIS launched over 100 attacks in Iraq, the highest number for the year 2020. Throughout the pandemic, attacks carried out by groups such as ISKP, Balochistan, Liberation Army, Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, Jamaatul Nas al-Islam, and others have claimed the lives of hundreds and continue to severely affect the livelihood of millions. Additionally, statistics for India, Pakistan, and the Malay archipelago showed no decline in terrorist attacks, even as the pandemic reached its full swing by the end of 2020. The roundtable discussion that we are having today aims to provide a platform for critical discussion on the interplay between interpretation of Islam, politics, and society. In particular, the RTD will focus on current developments of Islamic radicalism and extremism in the age of global pandemic, where the general burden of society has significantly increased and gaps in international and national security widen. Without further ado, we would like to call upon Professor Dato Dr. Muhammad Hashim Kamali to start with the presentation of this RTD. Over to you, Prof. Kamali.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Subhanaka la ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana innaka antal alimul hakim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My presentation today will be on extremism, terrorism, and Islam. Of these two expressions, extremism and radicalism, I think the first one is more inclusive. What is extremism? It is the opposite of moderation. I'tidal and wasatiyya. It violates the limits of moderation. But what are those limits and who set those limits? These limits are often set by laws and constitutions, or in the case of Islam, by the Quran and Sunnah in general consensus, also by the principles of morality and the general custom of society. But there is no consensus over what is considered to be extremist, because perspectives and philosophies differ. Extremism is often self-evident in normal situations, unless we are in a context, for example, that is technical. It is also changeable. Gay marriage is now gaining acceptance in some Western societies. At one time, it would not have been considered as such. In some technical situation, normally people would know what is extremist. But for example, if you are in a technical context of an aeroplane flying, for example, very close to the ground is extremist. How close, we don't know. It is rather technical. Not many people would know, but those who are in the know would understand. Extremism can also be in good things or in bad things. For example, one can be extremist in the implementation of justice. Laws are made, for example, for certain people and situations. A judge, for example, can be extremist if he applies the same law equally to a hardened criminal and a first-time offender. This can be sometimes, in a good context, you can be extremist. In a quite a well-known example that we can give is these cartoonists in Denmark, in French newspapers. They were advocating in their beliefs the freedom of expression, but went to extremes about that. Freedom is not to offend people; that is an abuse of freedom. But this shows that extremism is contextual, and it relates to the kind of beliefs and principles that one embraces. Extremists are often small groups of people, but they gain wider recognition than their numbers would dictate. This is because they speak in black and whites, and they are almost certain on their narrow kind of beliefs. Often they are also, they fail to persuade society, to persuade people, and they go on the streets in extremist action and violence to impress their views on others. There are the relevant literature on extremism divided into three types. In the Islamic context also, we know three types of extremist behavior. One is theological extremism, al-tatarruf al-i'tiqadi. And instances of this are as old as history. In the Islamic history, in the 1st century, for example, a number of extremist groups emerged, like the Qadariya, those who embrace the idea of free will, as opposed to Jahmiya, the follower Jahm bin Safwan, who embraced the idea of total predestination. The first group believed that man is totally responsible for his conduct. The second, that everything that we do is programmed, nothing that we cause ourselves. Both are extremists. Then there were the Murji'ah, the permanently hopeful, who did not pass any judgment on good or bad, in the hope that eventually the permanently hopeful, the Murji'ah. And then the Batiniya. The Batiniya also is a branch of Shia, the Ismailiyah, who embraced the beliefs that every word and sentence of the Quran has two meanings. One is the Zahir and the other the Batin. The obvious meaning in the hidden meaning. And the hidden meaning is only known to the Imam. Then we have known the Ghulat of Shia, the extremists of Shia, who elevated Ali Karamallahu Wajhu to the position of deity. And then in modern times, we have in Egyptian society the kind of, Jamaat al-Takfir wal-Hijra that denounce the Egyptian society, all of them as denounce them to kufr, that they are infidel and that we must boycott them and leave them. These are the kind of instances of theological extremism, al-tatarruf, al-i'tiqadi. And it seems that extremism is as old as history. It had existed. It exists in our time, like ISIS and Boko Haramis and so on. I will be talking about them. The second type is political extremism, al-tatarruf, al-siyasi. These categories are overlapping. They are not black and white. I mean, what is theological, what is political is not black and white. But political extremism is marked by defiance and challenge of the legitimate government and political authorities. An example of this in history, in Islamic history, was the Khawarij. The Kharijites who went to extremes, embraced beliefs in doctrines, political doctrines, that one who commits a major sin becomes a kafir. And some of them, there were many groups. The Azariqa believed that he becomes a kafir even he did it by mistake. One who, for example, passed ijtihad on something unlawful, he becomes a kafir. The rule is that we have a clear hadith that the mujtahid can be right, he can make mistakes. And both of them earn a reward. So these the Khawarij have gone way out of the middle path of Islam in moderation. They also, the Khawarij, declared Ali to be kafir because of his judgment on tahkim, on these arbitration issue, that between between the Khawarij and the Shia. Arbitration issue is a matter of political judgment. To declare someone kafir for that is way out of the moderate stream. And then practical extremism, al-tatarruf as al-amali. These practical extremism had existed at all periods in all times among us. For example, the self-immolation, like some groups, they punish themselves on religious occasions, or people who remain unmarried. Marriage to them is something um, unclean, unlawful, or whatever. And those who go practically in extremist, commit extremist behavior, like those who observe continuous fasting, Sawm al-Wisal, it's not required. These are instances of practical extremism. Terrorism is also practical extremism. Like we had these ISIS group, Islamic State of Iraq and Syria and so on. They went in to massacre people, innocent people, simply for their wanting to bring the Islamic Caliphate, civilians, innocent people. In the Zaidis, in Sinjab, for example, they killed them and they maimed them and they committed crimes against them in the name of Islam. They want to bring Islamic Caliphate. Boko Haramis, they go to extreme. They denounce modern education all to be a kind of, blasphemous to them. And the Taliban of Afghanistan, they have become terrorists. They commit crimes. Every day we hear that they kill. They kill people, government, soldiers in very, very brutal ways. So regardless of what they start with, but if they go to these kinds of behavior, that is practical extremism. And their combinations are also mixed. Like the ISIS groups, it is believed that about 1/3 of them are foreigners. They are neither Arabs, they are even people from Southeast Asia, from Malaysia. They would, young people, go to Syria to join these groups, people from Europe, from France, from Britain, from Germany. And they join these ISIS groups. Sometimes it's not quite understandable why it happens, but there is a tendency that it had existed. And from the Islamic viewpoint, which is my second context, of course, all kind of violence and terrorism and killing of innocent people is haram. It is by the clear declaration of the Quran, وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا النَّفْسَ الَّتِي حَرَّمَ اللَّهُ إِلَّا بِالْحَقِّ. Do not kill al-nafs, a living being, a human being, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made haram, unless it be in the cause of justice. من قتل مؤمنا متعمدا بغير حق فكأنما قتل الناس جميعا ومن أحياها فكأنما أحيا الناس جميعا. If you give life to someone, like you free a slave now, like you donate, for example, for someone critically ill. And this is the Islamic position is very clear. Protection of life is one of the higher objectives, the maqasid of Sharia. And the clear hadith, man hamala alayna salaha falaysa minna. Anyone who takes up arms against us without any good cause is not one of us. And then in another hadith, kullul muslimi ala al-muslimi haram, damuhu wa maluhu wa irduh. Every Muslim is, his life, his blood, his property is sacrosanct, is haram. to be violated by anyone. Then the realities are such that Muslims are themselves in our own times the principal victims of terrorism, extremism, and violence. In so many countries, in Afghanistan, Iraq, in Syria, Palestine, Pakistan, Libya, Somalia, you name it. Muslims are ridden with conflicts, endemic conflicts. They kill one another, engage in fratricide and violence for often no good cause. And they are victims of also, not all of them, their own making, of the violence of others who attack these countries. Currently, these countries are attacked by, in one way or another, by Americans. Violence, of course, begets violence. If these countries or armies think that responding with violent means will somehow cure violence, it is totally mistaken. It brings more violence. You need to understand the causes, what brings this violence, and to look into that rather than the simple attack against attack. Farid Zakaria, you might have heard his name on CNN. He announced some time earlier the result of a survey that was carried by two American scholars, Robert Pape and James Feldman. They analyzed 2,100 cases of documented suicide bombing committed from 1980 to 2009. And they found that the vast majority of those who committed suicide bombing, they didn't have a religious context. Most of them were acting against American intervention in the Middle Eastern countries, and they did not have even a religious motive. And this was also announced that Washington had interfered in 13 Muslim countries before 1980, and that continued kind of action and aggression. Still, we see it even today. The Muslim response to these instances of extremism has been principled, correct in principle. Like the Majlis Ulama Indonesia, the National Fatwa Council of Malaysia, Mufti of Saudi Arabia, International Muslim Organizations, all denounced the ISIS as criminals in committing barbarous acts of criminality. Without any hesitation, they declare them. And we know that, of course, the causes of terrorism are very varied. It's generally understood that it is either against foreign aggression or internal aggression, and against usually political dictatorship. The failure of good governance in the Muslim countries, it has spawned extremism. We have seen, unfortunately, more recently, the failure of even of the Arab Spring phenomena. Arab Spring spoke about, good governance and people's rights, yet we saw in the end that the dictators dug their heels, and Arab Spring became a dark Arab winter. It has become, they say that there is more dictatorship now in the Muslim world than there was before the Arab Spring. Unfortunately, this is a big failure and a big cause of also extremism. Then, of course, extremist behavior by countries like Israel, for example. The refusal to stop these aggressive settlements, for example, and the one-sided support that the Americans have given to Israel, and they continue that to this day. One would normally think, many have said that their response is out of desperation. If they commit suicide, suicide bombing and so on, what do you do? That is the kind of response the only response they can give, and often in those situations. Like violence begets violence. If people who commit those acts, they should expect nothing different. But it also means that governments and armies and the militarists, they are responding to violence by more violence. And there is something wrong in that. It's almost expected that this should happen. But this is the incorrect response, and there is a general case for these governments to look into the basic causes and address them and not be as violent as they have been in past. Thank you for your attention. Assalamu alaikum.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much, Prof. Dato Hashim Kamali, who has started with the presentation, I think, from the Islamic perspective, and also the discussion on this extremism. I think he started with the discussion on this extremism, which is against what we call it moderation. And when he mentioned about extremism, there are extremism in good things as well as extremism in bad things, and he has given examples of that. And I think there are three types of extremism which Prof. Kamali has mentioned. One is the theological extremism, which it is a tataruf al-i'tiqad, and he has given also a few examples of the groups those days. The second one is the political extremism, or we call it al-tataruf al-siyasi, also with some groups of that. And the last one would be the practical extremism, or we call it at-tataruf al-amali, which I think is continuing to happen until today. And I think he also mentioned about what's the fatwas by some Muslim countries as well as individual, including the largest Muslim group in Indonesia, Nahdlatul Ulama, which has called that this extremism is something which we have to fight for, because this is against from the teaching of Islam. And Prof. Kamali did mention that this is against from the teaching of Quran. So thank you very much, Prof. Kamali. Now we move to the second speaker, all the way from Jakarta, Indonesia. We are very delighted to have Bapak Kiai Haji Yahya Cholil Staquf, who is the Secretary General of Nahdlatul Ulama Indonesia, which I think the members exceed the population of Malaysia. I was told it is approximately about 90 million members, where our population in Malaysia is only about 32, 33. So I think this is the largest Muslim group, I suppose, perhaps in the world. So over to you, Bapak Yahya Cholil, please.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you for inviting me to this discussion. It is a great honor for me to join this high-level, high-profile discussion. Firstly, I want to emphasize what Professor Kamali just mentioned, that the phenomena of extremism is not new to us. It's been there, even starting from the very early era of Islamic history, since the Khawarij, and it's continued. The phenomenon continue to emerge time to time throughout the history of Islam. Professor Kamali mentioned what he called as theological extremism. That is uh, something that we need to admit that there are various theological formulation by Islamic intellectuals and ulamas, throughout our history, and many of them are considered to be authoritative and remain authoritative until now, which have various expression that we would call it fall into the category of extremism. Now, we need to understand that this theological formulation or the ijtihad cannot be separated from the actual social and political reality, which trigger or stimulate the emergence of various theological thoughts or ideas. So, for example, the emergence of Jabariyah certainly was related to the actual social political reality at that time, and including also the emergence of this group we call Khawarij, with all their theological framework emerged in relation with the actual political, social and political reality at that time. And if we look at, various theological ideas produced by the ulamas, time to time, we can always find the ideas emerged. We can always find the relation with the actual social political context at the time. For example, in the one of the books in fiqh, in Islamic jurisprudence, which is considered to be still authoritative until now, the Nahdlatul, for example, by Sheikh Osman bin Saud. It was written around the Middle Age, in the context of the establishment of the maybe Ottoman Turks at time. And in one part of that book, it is said that the offensive jihad is compulsory, is fardu kifaya, collective obligation, at least once a year. And that book is still considered to be, like I said, authoritative and still being taught in various Islamic educational institutions, including in Indonesia. Now, we understand that this kind of idea must be related to the social and political context, in the time where the idea emerged. But oftenly, and I think this is a general tendency among Muslims all over the world, that the authoritative status of various ideas in Islamic theology are considered to be having a sort of transcendent, status. So once an idea is considered authoritative as a product of ijtihad by a legitimate and authoritative mujtahid, then it is considered to be authoritative, eternally, because the doctrine is that ijtihad cannot be, discredited, by other ijtihad. That's the doctrine. So now, we have various theological ideas which we might consider in our time to be extremist, to be extreme ideas, but they were legitimate and authoritative in their time. For example, the idea of cutting hands as punishment for thievery, or the idea of death punishment for apostate, and so forth. Nowadays, most of us would consider those kinds of ideas as extreme, but they are legitimate in their time. Now, so we need to think more, and when we address the problem of extremism, we need to think more in the frame of social and political context and reality. The way I see it, what we have now, we have all these reports that prove that these extremist movements are resilient, and this situation of pandemic, even according to various reports from security agency in Indonesia, at least I have this picture about the way the extremist groups and movement see the situation of pandemic as an opportunity, first to gain more support from in the Muslim communities, and also they see an opportunity, when the political establishment is tend to become weaker over time and unstable because of this pandemic situation. And for example, in Indonesia, the police task force made various some raids, and they they make significant numbers of arrests on the extremist activists in Indonesia, because they found evidence that these people are preparing a significant attack when they see the situation, the political situation is right, which is, namely when unstable enough. And this is the reason on this phenomena of extreme with its national
Yeah. Okay, Bapak. Okay, please continue.
Yes, maybe if I may, I would want to make a short closing statement.
Panggil, just suara standby ya.
Okay, if I may. Yeah, I'm sorry. See, this ideology of Khilafah is a great threat to the establishment that we have, because they are aspired to have a universal caliphate, universal Khilafah, which means to dissolve all the nation-state establishment that exists now, because they want all to be unified in one universal single Khilafah all over the world. So Indonesia must be gone, Malaysia has to be gone, all these nations has to be gone and join the single Khilafah that they want to establish. So we need to have more consideration to the political dynamics.
Standby ya. Tadi ada macam ada tak ada dengar suara.
So it's not just about theological ideas. It's not just about how we define moderation and the line that separate moderation and extremism, but it's all about also the social and political dynamics domestically in each nations and also internationally, as the global order is also in a process of changing, and a lot of struggle is happening there. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Indeed, thank you very much. Syukran jazilan, Bapak Kiai Yahya Khalil Staquf, for your presentation. I think that we are very sorry, and we would like to apologize for the viewers and also participants in Zoom that we are having technical problems between Malaysia and Indonesia, in particular between Kuala Lumpur and Jakarta, due to these technical connections. But I think what I can, just a brief summary what Bapak Kiai Haji Yahya Cholil has presented is, I think he emphasized what Prof Kamali has discussed on this. Extremism is not new, it had happened before, and I think he also shared with regard to this political and also theological extremism. And one of the, I think the viewers and also the participants in the Zoom would like to ask questions to Bapak Kiai is with regard to his examples of this idea that could be considered as extremist, that in some way it has been legitimated. For example, he has mentioned about this cutting hands for theft as well, death punishment for apostasy, and these punishments have been considered as a type of extremism. In that sense. So that would be something, I think perhaps there will be question on that. And also towards the end of your presentation, Bapak Kiai, you mentioned about this, the so-called of this universal Khalifah or Khilafah that being proposed and propagated by certain groups. In particular, is I'm not mistaken, is the group by the name of Hizbut Tahrir. As for example, I think quite a number of countries around the world have, make this group ban this group because it will, it has, I'm calling it propagate the teaching of extremism. But the reason that they give is it is part of Islam, which we believe it is against from the teaching of Islam. I think that would be something that I can just brief summary from what Bapak Kiai Haji Yahya Khalid Staquf just presented. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we would like to move to our third speaker, Assistant Professor Dr. Ahmad Al-Muhammadi, who's from ISTAC. Yeah, I think Dr. Ahmad has been a very frequent the guest in many occasions talking about this subject matter, because I think his PhD thesis is specifically on this extremism and Islam. Perhaps on that note, I would like to call upon Dr. Ahmad. Over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Prof. Azam, the moderator. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Saleen. Sayyidina Muhammadi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa hlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. Prof. Hashim Kamali, the chairman of IAIS, and Pak Cholil from Indonesia, and SAC Azman from Bukit, Aman. Alhamdulillah, we have the opportunity here this morning to have this very fruitful discussion on a very, very interesting topic. And I believe that hopefully by the end of the discussion, we can benefit from the input shared by the panelists as well as the question from the audience. I think that the previous panelist has provided a very wonderful framework for us to understand the issue of extremism. Prof. Kamali provided a conceptual analysis for this, as well as the Pak Cholil provides the socio-political context of what is going on in the realm of extremism today. In my presentation today, I would like to go back to the subject matter or the title of this discussion, that is Islam, Radicalism, Extremism in the Age of Pandemic. So the general theme that I would like to answer is, how can we make sense the relationship or the interplay between Islam, radicalism, extremism in the context of the pandemic. So in this presentation, I would like to mention three key points. First, the concept of framing. Understanding the concept of framing or the framing theory is extremely important and vital for us to understand how the narrative of pandemic is constructed and perceived and organized and communicated by the communicator to the audience, and therefore how this narrative could actually form the discourse of extremism and radicalism. So basically, the idea of framing is referring to the how the narrative is crafted, or how people organize, perceive, and communicate the reality to the audience. So they are going to use a kind of anecdotes or stereotype that they use in order to make sense and understand what is going on around them, or the event which is taking place in the society. So in general, people are using framing to construct reality, especially in the media. So framing usually is not like an independent concept. It is usually, and most of the time, is operationalized in the context of media or agenda setting tradition. So therefore, by having framing certain narrative, it will shape the discourse. So this is the first point that I would like to mention. And we are going to see how this framing is going to shape the discourse of the pandemic. So The second point that I would like to highlight is what is the global narrative of the pandemic? So if we look at the global narrative, I mean, it's not just only national narrative of the pandemic or regional narrative, but if we look at the global level narrative of the pandemic, we can see that there are four orientation of narrative that we can find. First is, I call this medical-oriented narrative. Medical-oriented narrative basically, or focusing mainly on the medical fact of the virus, of the pandemic. So it is usually participated by the professional medical expert in this discussion. All right? So it is a fact-based discourse by the medical expert, by the professional, in order to ensure the survival of the state, national security, human security, and health policy. So this is common. This is happened among the medical community. We don't have a problem with that because it is actually based on fact. Second is the policy-oriented narrative. The policy-oriented narrative is involved or focusing on the policy making in order to create social and economic resilience, recovery, prevention, emphasizing on human security or the best practices in prevention, in detection or mitigation. For example, if you look at the presidential candidate, Joe Biden, before when he ran for the president, he was saying that science-based policy, that was his narrative. So that is a policy-oriented narrative or discourse which is actually going on in certain community. So that is the second. The third discourse is a political narrative, the political-oriented narrative. So political-oriented narrative is actually, so if we talk from medical point of view, yes, we can discuss that, okay, the virus is, okay, has the origin in certain ecosystem, therefore it grows from medical point of view. However, we also need to remember that the discussion of pandemic or the virus has political side as well. So it is the political dimension of the pandemic. For example, this is very popular during former President Trump, the China virus. President Trump was propagating the idea of China virus, or the virus which is coming from China. China exporting virus. This is basically involved disinformation, news, right? Misinformation, conspiracy theories, or anti-vaccine movement, which is not only taking place in the Muslim community, but also among the other communities as well. If you look at in the United States, there are a lot of people actually view the pandemic as something which is, well, from the theory conspiracy point of view. And they even say this is the sign, the end of times. And they refuse to adhere to the government's policy to wear masks, for example. And they will go out to the beach, enjoying themselves without taking care of any persecution. So this is another form of narrative that is political-oriented narrative. The fourth one is religious-oriented narrative, which is mentioned by Prof. Hashim Kamali just now. It's because from religious-oriented narrative, it will produce, actually, basically, is theological extremism, which is mentioned. Tatarruf al-i'tiqadi mentioned by Prof. Kamali just now. So we can see this also. There are a group of people who are discussing this narrative from religious point of view by highlighting this. This is the end of times, apocalypse discourse, or pandemic as the punishment by God for its failure to implement Islamic laws or Sharia. Okay, and it is a form of bala, calamity for Muslim or for the people in this akhir zaman, the end of the world. So if we relate this discourse with the Kalimah Allah issue, so it getting more popular when it is connected with a religious-oriented discourse like this, because they see that their failure to protect the word Allah could be one of the reasons why we have this calamity. So I would say this is the most popular discourse, that is political, religious-oriented narrative. And of course, if we examine those discourse, it is not necessarily based on fact, but I call this a post-truth narrative. It is based on the perception, based on the fiction, but people tend to believe it. It's actually, they gain more followers, they gain more support on traction for this discourse. Now, number 3, how this framing, as I said earlier, that we have 4 narratives just now, that is the medical, the policy, political, and religious oriented narrative. How this narrative framing, the narrative of the framing of this narrative generate radicalization, and therefore leads to extremism and violent extremism or radicalism. First, let us look at the concept of radicalization. Radicalization is basically the process of acquiring extremist idea, right? Internalizing radical ideas and translating them into an action or violent act. So it's a process which is taking place in the form of thinking, like cognitive-oriented radicalization could be in the form of ideas, also in the form of emotion, in the form of belief, and later the last stage of radicalization is the violence, or the physical and actual act. So the last end, or the end part of radicalization is the violence, is the action. So let us go to the actual case. I would like to bring about 2 cases. Case study number 1 is the China virus narrative. If you look at the China virus narrative, even though it is a fact, yes, the virus is coming from China. It is reported by the World Health Organization. It's from Wuhan, China. However, because of it is propagated in the media and it is widely reported in the media, it leads to an upsurge of racial-based attack against the Asian community in the United States. So this is the idea how the narrative, which is actually non-violent in nature, it's just like a narrative, basically, just like a story that you tell to everybody, but it is spread all over the place, all over the media, the social media, in the traditional media, and it is spoken about in the community, in the public. However, there are certain people take this thing further, translating these ideas of China virus. Therefore, if we have a Chinese, if we have an Asian in the community, therefore you have to attack them because they are actually the one who brought the virus into the United States. And to make the situation even worse, it is coincided with the rise of right-wing movement in the United States, the white supremacy, and of course, all-time high problem of Islamophobia. So now we have the problem of pandemic in one hand, and it leads to racial based attacks against the Asian community, not only in the United States, but also in Europe, and also Islamophobia. So it is not only to the Asian, but it is also connected to Islamophobia. Of course, the ISIS is another factor who's actually propagated the idea of the end of times, the pandemic as the punishment of Allah to the Chinese government who are actually persecuting the Uyghur people, Xinjiang people. And those governments who fail to implement the Islamic law, this is a warning to them as well. So that is the case number 1. We can see clearly right now that how that narrative either could be combination of political, religious, policy leads to radicalization. Why is happened? Framing. How you frame the narrative. and actually can influence how people act. Now we go to case number 2, that is the ISIS narrative. ISIS believe that the pandemic is the punishment of God against China for persecuting Uyghurs, and the failure to implement Sharia, it is bala from Allah, and therefore what happened now, this pandemic, is actually legitimates the struggle of ISIS for an Islamic state, for the caliphates. And against what makes ISIS even more relevant in this discourse is because he said that we are representing the end of times, the Alamat, the black flag. The black flag, that's why it carried the black flag, because he said that we are actually the last generation of people that you have to follow, that you have to join together to follow our struggle to the establishment of an Islamic state. And this is, again, also, it has the element of the apocalypse. So here is the trick. Here is the very, very interesting twist. This kind of belief is actually part of Islamic tradition, part of Islamic belief as well. We believe in the apocalypse. We believe in the Alamat Sa'ah. We believe in the ends of time. We also believe in the bala from Allah. Okay, as I mentioned, for example, in the Surah At-Taghabun, verses 11, Ma asaba min musibatin illa biiznillah. Wa man yu'min billahi yahdi qalbahu wallahu bikulli shay'in alim. No calamity befall anyone except by Allah's will. It is very clear. It is part of our belief. So, but this group, they make use of these verses to legitimize their struggle, saying that, you see here, no calamity will take place unless it is actually permitted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they also make use of one hadith, which is very interesting. From Abdullah bin Omar, for example, it mentioned about there is no disease and illness will appear in our society except that you have done a very, very sinful act. So it is mentioned in this hadith, for example, wal awja'u allati lam takun madat fi islafihim allazina madaw, means that you will never see any kind of disease after that you committed a lot of sinful acts. So this is again the narrative of a religious narrative that being used by certain group. But I would like to remind you, all of us here, this is also part of the prophetic tradition. So much so the Quranic verses mentioned earlier, that is Surah At-Taghabun, verses 11, that is ma asaba min musibatin illa biiznillah. This is part of our belief. So right now, our part is to how to differentiate between this is the true tradition of Islam. This is what Islam taught. This is an Islamic teaching, and this is deviation. So this is our responsibility. Our duty is to do this. So the point of deviation here, as I said earlier, how to differentiate. The point of deviation here is that the adoption of violence in the name of religious call. So if they just believe, because it is part of our belief, the pandemic is actually coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they're also using this, but they hijack this narrative in order to legitimize the struggle, that is to promote violence, to establish so-called Islamic State in the names of jihad and committing violence against other people. So I think this is the point, or the way forward that we have to discuss further. And I end here first. Thank you very much, Prof. Azam.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Ahmad, for your presentation. I think he has shared with us a few important points I think beginning with the framing, how the framing of pandemic COVID-19 shaped the discourse of extremism and radicalism. And also he shared with us of these four narratives, of these global narratives of pandemic, namely the medical-oriented narratives, the policy-oriented narratives, political-oriented narratives, and lastly but not least, I think the most important part of our discussion is the religious-oriented narratives. And he has given all the examples of these four narratives. And also how the framing generates radicalism, where he mentioned the radicalization is the process of acquiring extremist idea, and he shared a few forms of this. And with the presentation of this, the framing generates radicalization, he has given us examples of how this the so-called discussion on this China virus narratives, as well as these ISIS narratives. And last but not least, he mentioned about this, the surah, or we call it the verse 11 of the Surah At-Taghabun, with regard to this ayah, Ma asaballahu min musibah illa biiznillah. I think that would be some of the points that which I can summarize from Dr. Ahmad's presentation. Perhaps viewers and participants, you may ask questions pertaining to his presentation later. Ladies and gentlemen, we have last but not least, our final speaker is SAC Azman, Assistant Director, Bukit Aman Special Branch of Royal Malaysia Police. I think we are indeed delighted to have SAC Azman, which I think will share with us what we call it, perhaps some of the cases, the reality that the authority is experiencing over this radicalism as extremism. Over to you, SAC Azman.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed. Please.
Okay, good. So, a very good morning. Yang berbahagia, Profesor Dato Muhammad Azam, the moderator. Yang berbahagia, Profesor Dato Dr. Muhammad Hashim Kamali. Yang berbahagia, Bapak Kiai Yahya Cholil. Yang berbahagia, Associate Professor Dr. Ahmad El-Muhammadi. Right. So, a very good morning and Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. So, since the three panelists has been presenting about in terms of academically and theologically perspective, for my side, I'm representing the PDRM. I'll be mostly talking about in terms of practical perspective from our, I can say that from our police perspective, what we have been doing since before the pandemic and also during the pandemic. So let me start. I just say some of the things that we have been doing before the pandemic, right? So as is generally known, since 2013, the Special Branch E8 Division has detained a total of 558 people suspected of being involved with Daesh terrorist group. This is excluding the JI members that we have arrested before the emerging of Daesh. So out of that number, a total of 256 of them have been prosecuted in court. 51 were tried under the Prevention of Criminal Act, or POCA. 37 were tried under the Prevention of Terrorism Act, POTA, and the rest have been released unconditionally. So presently, most of these detainees have completed their sentences, and the E8 Division has conducted regular monitoring of them. So this monitoring of these ex-detainees is very important to ensure that they would not be involved in their past activities. And moreover, while serving their sentences in prison or detention, in detention centers, They also went through our rehabilitation programs as a preparation for them to return to the mainstream of society. Although the activities of these terrorist groups in Malaysia are seen to be slowing down and posing less of a threat to our national security, the monitoring is still conducted by the E8 division. This is because the result of our monitoring in the social media shows that during this pandemic, recruitment activities are still taking place. I just mentioned one of the several cases. We are now still monitoring one Malaysian woman who is involved in trying to recruit other youngsters, especially the Malaysian youngsters, to become extremists. I don't want to mention her name because we are still monitoring her. So this is part of our effort to counter extremism in the social media. So, however, the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic in Malaysia has really affected the activities of terrorist groups. When border controls were tightened, making it difficult for these terrorist groups to penetrate the country's borders. So what can be seen currently is that the struggle of terrorist groups is not as great as during the days of the rise of Daesh group in Syria back in 2014. And we have seen that after the death of each charismatic leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the Daesh group seems to have lost its cause. And moreover, tight controls on the Syrian border make it difficult for especially Malaysians to move there. Right? So besides the death of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, a number of well-known Malaysian Daesh militants have also died in Syria as a result of engagement with the Syrian military. So one of them is the former top recruiter who was responsible for masterminding several planned militant attacks in Malaysia before. He's Muhammad Al-Muhammadi, who was killed by a US drone attack on 29 April 2017. So Wandi was a charismatic recruiter who used his social media platforms to connect with supporters and potential recruits in Indonesia and Malaysia. So besides Wandi, other well-known Malaysian personalities that were also killed in battle were Zainuri Kamaruddin, Muhammad Fuda Omar, Muhammad Nizam bin Arifin, alias Abu Afghan, Muhammad Rafiuddin, and Muhammad Akil Zainal, or Akil Zainal, who was the former drummer for the UK's group band in Malaysia. So the death of these several personalities somehow affected the spirit and morale of other Malaysian foreign terrorist fighters. Those 56 Malaysian foreign fighters who are still left in Syria right now are those lesser known members of Malaysian FTFs, comprising 19 men, 12 women, and 25 children. So 18 of them are being held in Al-Hol camp, Syria, 9 in Roj camp, Syria, another 9 in Al-Hasakah prison, Syria, and 3 in Idlib prison, Syria. And definitely, while in detention, these prisoners are not allowed to have access to phone and internet. So the police in Malaysia have made only 7 counterterrorism arrests in 2020, and that this dramatic drop in arrests reflects a change in our policing strategy. However, extremism still remains a threat to the country as well as in this region. So the reducing number of arrests doesn't mean the terror threat has decreased, but the coronavirus-related movement restrictions have much affected everyone, including the sympathizers and the supporters of the Daesh group. And in 2020, our E8 division only arrested a total of 7 individuals. So the truth is that the COVID-19 pandemic came to Malaysia as a blessing in disguise. And by comparison, Malaysia arrested 72 Daesh-linked suspects in the year 2019 and 119 suspects the year before that, in 2018. Okay, let's see the cases in 2020, right? This one is just right before the pandemic. On 6 to 7 January 2020, we have arrested a local, one Amirul Azlan bin Jalaluddin, along with 5 members of the Ansarullah At-Tawhid group, following their involvement in making Daesh propaganda videos and death threats against the country's leaders. So during the interrogation, one Amirul admitted that he intended to launch a lone wolf attack targeting several government leaders by stabbing them with a knife or a sharp object as a sign of support for Daesh. So these targeted government leaders, Tun Mahathir, Lim Guan Eng, Dr. Mujahid Raya, and the AG Chambers, Tommy Thomas. And in the same year, in August 2020, we have arrested one Malaysian man working in Singapore. So actually, this man was arrested by the Internal Security Department of Singapore, and they have handed him to us. So this Malaysian man was involved in the funding of militant activities, and he was also planning to go to Syria to join Daesh group. Okay, that was in 2020. In this year alone, actually we have no arrests. We have none of the suspects that we have arrested for this year alone. Because the spread of COVID-19 pandemic in Malaysia and the strict movement control order has made it difficult for our E8 division to launch arrest operation due to constraint in terms of intelligence as well as the health risk to our personnel involved. And the closure and tight control of our country's entry and exit gates has seen a decline in cross-border activities and crime, including the infiltration of militant elements from within and outside the country. And the death of the main leader of the Daesh group, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, has resulted in the decline in terms of support and the spreading of Daesh ideology, as his Baghdadi successor, Abu Ibrahim al-Hashimi al-Quraishi, is seen as less charismatic and less prominent. And added to this, the extreme monitoring of social media by government authorities, not only in Malaysia but also by other countries, has resulted in the intensity of activities by extremists in cyberspace started to wane. So due to health, security, and pandemic prevention measures, the daily movement and activities have been restricted. So this has indirectly reduced the risk and flattened the curve of terrorism in Malaysia. However, our E8 division is still continuing monitoring for any signs of threat. And so far, there is no indication of advanced threat present, except the radicalization attempts that occurred mostly in cyberspace for online activities, whether they be fundraising, radicalization, recruitment, or simply viewing Daesh videos or other media. And it is highly unlikely that Daesh sympathizers top online radicalization. So for me, spending more time online doesn't make a person radical or extremist. So during this pandemic, and we are also seeing for the future of terrorism-related cases after the pandemic. So what is our direction of E8 division? So our counter-terrorism division is implementing a change in strategy in dealing with terror threats. Our division now is no longer conducts large-scale arrests as what we had normally done before. So in the past, our strategy was more on proactive prevention, right? That's why we have so many large-scale arrests. But this time, the policy set by our top brass requires solid evidence of involvement in extremist or terrorist activities before making any arrest. So our justification must be strong, together with stronger evidences, in order to strengthen the facts of the case before forwarding it to the AG chambers. And in responding to threats, our EA division have to weigh the seriousness of the offense and gauge whether executive, preventive, or rehabilitative action is needed. I think that is the end of my briefing. So we just wait for the question and answers. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, SAC Azman Omar, for your presentation. I think as we have we are expected before, I think the PDRM from division shared a few cases of this group, and I think you have mentioned a certain numbers of these people were detained and also being rehabilitated. Perhaps I think there will be questions pertaining to what. How do you tackle these people during this detention, especially what are the measures of rehabilitation that you are introduce for this group of people? And I think you also mentioned that there's a blessing in disguise of this pandemic, and it is a slow bit of this group. Nevertheless, there are certain numbers of, call it raid, and also captured by the authority with regard to these particular groups. And I think it is not only a threat to Malaysia, but also in this region, as you mentioned. With that, we would like to thank SAC Azman for that presentation. Now we move to the question and answers. Can we have this chart from the Zoom room first for the participants? I've seen there are under this Q&A there are 4 perhaps participant raised on these questions. Okay. We have a question by Andrew Q. Perhaps I think I open to all the speakers who would like to respond. Would groups of Muslims opposing the taking of COVID-19 vaccine during the current pandemic be seen as extremism in Islam? Are there any example of this in the Islamic world? How should law enforcement authorities address such groups? Perhaps anyone, Prof, would you like to respond to that question, Prof?
Well, I think one ought to be able to distinguish when you speak of extremism, you are thinking of 2 extremes, one on this side and the other on the other side. And there are a lot of cases that fall in between. Now people, we call extremists those who have we have shown them good reason and they do not accept that reason and they still stick to their one narrow viewpoint. In this case, I believe that there are certain positions people take because they see some evidence that they think is worth considering. We have, for example, against AstraZeneca, we have had some cases of clotting, and these are not many, and it becomes a kind of a political context. Which country accepts, which country does not accept, and those are additional factors why some people may be more open, others not. So I think that I would find it difficult to consider those extremists. It may be that if in a certain situation a person is particularly ill and there is the medical advice that this person must take certain medication or this vaccine in order to save his own life, and then he still refuses, that may be called extremism. Extremist in that case. But generally speaking, of people who have some evidence and certain information on which they act, I would be hesitant to call them extremists.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Kamali. Dr. Ahmad, you want to respond to this question or just enough? Okay. Okay, can we go to the second question by Hadi Azmi? Recently, it was reported that Jamaah Islamiyah is gaining strength in the Malaysian Borneo state of Sabah, with the state police commissioner saying the state could see an attack similar to 2002 Bali bombings if nothing is done. His question is JI really coming back? Is the threat as serious as described by Sabah police? I think perhaps SAC Azman can respond to this.
Yes, thank you. As far as the police is concerned, JI, the number of JI that we have arrested before the rise of Daesh is, the number is 132 of them. So some of them has been, because at that time, we don't have SOSMA laws. So we detain the JI suspects. We use the Internal Security Act, right? So this 132, they comprise several, most of them were detained at our Kamuting camp in Taiping, Perak. And almost all of them, I think all of them have been released after undergoing our rehabilitation program. And now, and during the pandemic, we are not focusing on JI, because as far as I'm concerned, as far as E8 division is concerned, we don't have any solid evidence saying that JI is coming back, even though Abu Bakar Bashir has been released from prison in Indonesia. However, we are still, besides monitoring Daesh militants, we are also monitoring ex-JI detainees who has been released from the detention centers way back in 2007, 2009, up to 2012. So we have been seeing these JI detainees frequently. Our officers are all spread on the ground all over Malaysia. We are seeing these detainees almost every month, and we have yet to receive any solid intelligence saying that JI will come back as severe as what they has been doing way back in the early 2000s. So JI was active and was very notorious during the years after 911 up to 2007, right? Up to 2007, we focused more on JI because at the time, JI was still an organization that we have to focus because of their because they are very dangerous, and they tend to JI compared to Daesh. JI we we see JI is more dangerous than Daesh, right? Because JI, they are more organized, and it seems that they are capable of building large-scale bombs, like what we have observed in the two Bali bombings. So to answer the question, so far we don't see any. We don't have any intelligence saying that JI is coming back, and if there is, we should have already known by now, right? So this is to answer the question. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
Makarandas from, I think it's it seems that she's from the Philippines. I think I'm a little bit confused with the question, but I think I try to make it in the proper sense, the sentence. She says that our problem is when the extremist Christians and communists arrive as a settler in Mindanao in year 1971, killing Muslims. And the Muslims, they protect themselves from the invasion to Muslims area. So the Muslims being more extremes caused by the protect themselves and their land. After that, we convene ourselves to have a good relation with our government in Philippines. Now, all Muslims were adopted by the Philippines government to avoid this accusing against Muslim in the Philippines. Her question is, the problem is the communist Christians are still existing, and they have, entering the land of the Muslims. So what are the terrorists and who are the extremist group between us? Whether there are Christians or there are Muslims. And if you have a capacity and capability, how can you help the Muslim victims in this capacity? So I don't know who can answer these questions. Anyone can. I think because we give the opportunity for the participants in the Zoom to ask questions. So any response of these questions? SAC Azman, or you have any? Or Prof would like to respond. Okay.
I'm unfamiliar with that question.
Okay.
I can answer the question.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, Prof.
Answer, but maybe a mixed scenario is developing. In such situation, it is one question is who is really going to extremes and who is causing the kind of scenarios that is described. In such situation, I think the government party is involved and they are giving some instruction. I think the advice may be that government authorities usually they do not take extremist positions. They are expected to address the problems and to give advice that may be worth considering. I think in such scenarios, I would say that we should listen to proper guidance and proper advice. If that is available, that is what people should be doing. But beyond that, it is really not something that I can say much about.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Kamali. We have questions from the Facebook viewers. Question from Brother Sayuti. The question is addressed to Dr. Ahmad Al-Muhammadi. Does the anti-vaccine phenomena in our country nowadays that viewed the vaccination program as part of the global conspiracy can also be considered as radical extremist thought? How can terrorist groups such as ISIS make use of this thought to their cause. And a question to from Brother Sayuti to SAC Azman: how the COVID-19 pandemic affects counter-terrorism measures in Malaysia? Does it give an advantage to the police, or instead make it more difficult? So we may have Dr. Ahmad Sayuti, Dr. Ahmad Al-Muhammadi first, followed by SAC Azman to respond to the question.
Could you repeat the question?
Okay, does the anti-vaccine phenomena in our country nowadays that viewed the vaccination program as part of the global conspiracy can also be considered as radical extremist thought? How can terrorist groups such as, that is one,
Yeah.
how can terrorist groups such as ISIS make use of these thoughts to their cause?
Thank you very much for the question. I have to admit that the question is very challenging to be answered in a straightforward manner. But I would say those people who disagree with the administration of the vaccine cannot be called as the extremist. Because I would suspect that the reservation of those people from taking the vaccine is due to several reasons or factors. It is not because of the certain extremist ideology that they have. But one of the factors would be lack of information about the true workings of the vaccines. So the lack of information, lack of understandings, or discussion about that vaccine contribute to those reservations attitude by certain people. To call those people who reject or reserve from taking the vaccine as an extremist would be, I think, a little bit too much. Number two, the global conspiracy theories. Of course, the framing like this is dangerous, I would say. I will go back to the first point that I mentioned earlier. How certain idea or event is framed and communicated to the public. So if we frame that the taking of vaccine as a manifestation of the global conspiracy is, and therefore is communicated to the public and propagated, disseminated all over in the social media, this kind of thinking, this kind of narratives, it in itself is dangerous. Because first, it is not based on the, it is not a fact-based narrative. You can say whatever you want, actually. People can manufacture a lot of narrative, a lot of craft the narrative in certain way, or frame the narrative in certain way for whatever happened in this world, and try to relate that with the conspiracy theory. You can do that. I remember it's happened in the Southern Thai. Just only take one event, how the event is framed and crafted in certain way, and it is affect the way people think. There was a lack of water or drought happened in the southern Thailand before, because of the natural causes. There is no water, there is no rain, and people cannot plant the rice. The news was spread among the villagers in that area, saying that the government of Thailand stopping the water from coming down to the southern Thailand. This is what the story, and the people believe it. So this is how the event was crafted and framed in certain way that affect how people think, how people interpret certain event, and therefore by having this kind of thought, it could lead to extremism and therefore violent action. So in conclusion, I would say, saying that the global narrative, I mean, is the vaccine as a global conspiracy, is that narrative itself is actually a manifestation of the radical narrative. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmad. SAC Azman, would you respond to the question?
Yes, I remember the question as well. So I think I have answered the question in my presentation, and I just repeat it again. So in 2020, we only met 7 arrests, right? And this dramatic drop in arrests, it somehow part of it is it reflects a change in our policing strategy, right? So the reducing number of arrests doesn't mean the terror threat has decreased, right? But the pandemic related movement restrictions have actually affected everyone, including the sympathizers and the supporters of the extremist group or Daesh group. Yeah? And as what I said just now, that COVID-19 came to Malaysia as a blessing in disguise. So most of this reducing in the number of arrests is most part of it is because of the restricted movement control order. However, somehow we don't deny that radicalization still still is still active in cyberspace. From where we are still monitoring several individuals that we seen as which attract our attention. Right? Thank you.
The speakers in Malaysia, I think we haven't heard anything from Jakarta. Bapak Kiai, would you like to respond to any of the questions that have been raised? Or otherwise, I think I have one particular question which I can address to you. Bapak Kiai?
Yes, actually, yes, if I may. See, interestingly enough, in the early time of the pandemic, ISIS actually ruled a set of fatwas which are in alignment with the parameters set by WHO, meaning they call their members and supporters to follow the health protocol, to wear masks, well, everything, including social distancing and so forth. So, and that's one thing. Now, I would say that these pandemic situations for this extremist movement, because they are very active, they are seeing that this pandemic situation as an opportunity. First, to get they are hoping that this situation then can weaken the governments in various countries, and that will open more opportunity for them to launch their actions or attacks. And they are indeed preparing for significant attacks in the future, just waiting for the right times. That's what I got from the reports from various security agencies in Indonesia, including the Special Detachment 88 and the National Task Force for Anti-Terrorism. And also, so one narrative can be used as vehicle to various different interests. For example, this narrative of anti-faction, narrative of global conspiracy. We know that it's been used by other problematic movements, such as the racist movement in America, for example, the white supremacist movement. So I think, and we can find evidence everywhere that the supporters of this Islamic extremist movements are also using this global conspiracy narrative in spreading and in their efforts to influence the social situation. My reading is that they use this narrative to increase the anxiety among the society, and that will help them to propagate more ideas of anti-establishment and anti-government, because the ultimate goal of these movements is to bring down all the establishment and replace them with the one that they want to establish themselves, which is the universal caliphate. So that is my reading about their situation. So actually, is the idea can be the idea of anti-vaccine itself can be considered an extreme idea, maybe not, but the purpose of spreading the idea has this extremist motivation behind it, and they're doing it in a deliberate, strategic way. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bapak. Okay, since you are still there, I think I just would like to respond to the points that you mentioned, and you give examples during your presentations, how these examples of punishments in Islam, like the cutting hands of the thefts, and also death punishment on this on apostasy, that you have mentioned that somehow it can also lead to these extreme ideas in Islam. Perhaps you can address a bit more on that, because people will see it as a negative perspective rather than having a good explanation from you. Bapak, can I please?
Yes, you see, I think you can see that generally in our modern society, the view to such extreme punishments like chopping hands is not that positive. People tend to see that to be too much, for punishment. That's one thing. And you can see that not just in non-Muslim society, but also in Muslim society. Like in Indonesia, you can see that but people generally are not favorable to extreme physical punishment. Now, the more problematic is this kind of punishment, such as the related to non-Muslims, such as the death punishment to apostates, because for apostasy, because it's there in the Islamic discourse, and is considered to be considered to remain authoritative until now, and it's a very, very difficult subject to discuss with most of the ulamas, not just in Middle East, but also in Indonesia. Now, and it is very, very problematic, because now we have more heterogeneous demography in most of societies in the world. Muslims in Europe, for example, have grown into a more and more significant communities living as minorities there. Now, if then a Muslim majority society, enforced an extreme and any kind of laws that can be considered as discriminative or even extreme punishment, such as death to apostasy, it's going to be very problematic. It's going to have very problematic impact for our Muslim fellows living as minorities elsewhere. So I would say that we need a broader discussion, not just to define the line of extremism, which is extreme and which is not. Not just that, but we need a broader dialogue between various different civilizations, because now you have more than just Islamist extremism. You have Buddhist extremism in Myanmar. You have Hindu extremism in India. You have this white supremacist extremism in the West, and so forth. You have secular extremism also, which consider religion, not just Islam, all religions as problems. And they really truly believe that all religion should be eradicated. If you remember that song by John Lennon, imagine there's no heaven above us, only sky, no hell below us, and no religion too, and so forth. So this kind of potential vicious conflict in the future must be considered, and we need to open a broader dialogue between different civilizations to find a consensus on what should we hold together as a fundamental and as a foundation of our future civilization together, because the world is going into a one single global, interfused civilization, and you cannot avoid other groups, to be, it's just we're all living together in the same neighborhood. So this is a deeper problem than just judging the line of extremism and radicalism. Thank you.
Okay, we have I think 3 last questions, which I think I need to take this because they are participants in our Zoom room. Okay, the question from Norfida Ismail is addressed to Dr. Ahmad. How should we integrate the elements of moderation in a narrative that shapes such kind of extreme thought of pandemic? Dr. Ahmad, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for those people who asked the question. I would like to mention 3 points with regards to the question asked just now. The moderation approach or wasatiyah approach in understanding the pandemic can be summarized in the following manner. First is the recognition of the pandemic as coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As mentioned in the Quran, Surah At-Taghabun, verses 11 just now, Ma asabatum musibatin illa bi'iznillah. That's number one. We have to believe that everything which has happened in this world, whether we know, whether we don't know, whether it is small or whether it is big, it is coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because of Allah's will. It's the God's will. That is number one. It is part of our aqidah. It is part of our belief in the qada wal qadar. It's part of our belief in the supremacy and the almighty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's number one. Number two, we have to go for prevention mode. We acknowledge the existence of the challenge of the virus, of the disease in our society. We cannot deny that it doesn't exist. Just like what happened to some communities, they reject the idea of the existence of the pandemic. They say that this is conspiracy theory and so on and so forth. As Pani Khalid mentioned just now, it's a secular extremist as well, which is taking place in other communities, in other countries, in the United States, in Europe. There are those people who actually do not believe this is actually part of this is the real challenge that we have as a humanity. So understanding COVID-19 pandemic as the crisis of humanity is not the crisis of certain races or nations. So we have to tackle this problem together. That is number two. Number three, we don't have to resort to violence. this is the problem for a certain group. Whenever they craft the narrative saying that this is the time for revolution or for a change, and the change must take place in the form of violence. So these are the three things that I can mention at the moment, that the Wasatiyah approach is the recognition of the virus or the pandemic is coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, prevention, and of course, there is no violence. But I also would like to go to the next question, which is mentioned by Alia Natasha, asking about the pandemic has influenced certain people to do or to commit violence. Yes, it is true. This is happening. As I mentioned earlier, this is not only happened in the Muslim community, but also in the secular society in other countries as well. But to go to the level of enacting an act by the government in order to prevent or stop people from thinking in certain way, I think maybe it is too early. The existing legal system that we have is already enough to tackle this problem. We also need to respect the differences of opinion. But we need to encourage more civil discourse, the discussion in the civil manner about differences, to give a proper understanding to the people about this issue. And I think that we can solve this problem in more in an amicable way rather than in the violence manner. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ahmad. You have answered questions that I asked you, as well as you answered question by Alia Natasha. We have this one question. It both appeared in the on this Zoom, as well on from, I think perhaps from our FB. It is from Mashita Anwar Musaddat. She thinks that the headline of the news also plays its role in making someone becoming extremist in this pandemic. So what do you think? Perhaps I think, I mean, any speakers or perhaps Prof, we would like to respond to this. So the headlines of news can somehow plays its role in making someone becoming extremist in this pandemic. The headline of news.
Yes, of course, I agree. And this was actually covered by Dr. Ahmad's discussion. How do you frame the narrative? How do you frame the, the kind of communication that you convey? Yes, what do you think? Yes, I agree. How do you frame your story? That has an effect on people becoming extremists in this situation of the pandemic. This is, pandemic itself creates a sensitive, situation. People are sometimes, the disease move people to from the middle part to the side. So one has to be very careful how you communicate this sensitive information to the people. Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm afraid that I cannot take any more questions. I think we are almost 1 o'clock. I think we have been discussing on this Islam, radicalism, and extremism in the age of pandemic almost 2 hours. And on behalf of IAIS Malaysia, we would like to thank again, of course, our founding CEO, Prof. Dato, Dr. Hashim Kamali, Kiai Haji Yahya Khalil Staquf, Secretary General of Nahdlatul Ulama Indonesia, Assistant Professor Dr. Ahmad Al-Muhammadi from ISTAC-IIUM, SAC Azman Omar, Assistant Director, Bukit Aman, Special Branch, Royal Malaysia Police, and all the participants in the room of Zoom, as well as viewers outside there of FB Live. Once again, we would like to thank you for your participations and all the good questions that we addressed. Till then, we will meet again in our next program. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.